Hello everyone, welcome to the Officially Denied podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Toby. So to kick off the podcast, I'd like to thank everybody for following us on our Instagram, who's done so already, at Officially Denied on Instagram. If you've not followed us on our Instagram yet, please do so, because we will be interacting with everybody on there, using polls, using stories, and most importantly, you can reply to our stories or send us messages with any news stories or topics that you'd like us to talk about. It can be about anything. It doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to be just film. We can also talk about music or any other topic that you find interesting as a listener.
So I guess to begin, we should go across the pond and talk about the mighty government shutdown, which lasted for less than a day on Monday, before Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell finally came to, well, I want to say they came to a deal, but really what basically happened was the Democrats just decided to give up and gave McConnell exactly what he wanted the previous Friday, leaving everyone wondering what the heck the whole point of the entire endeavor was.
I actually found out of the government shutdown not only through Twitter, but through NASA's Instagram posts, funnily enough. They made a couple posts saying that they weren't going to respond to any comments or make any announcements during the shutdown in a kind of act of protest. So at least personally, that's how I found out that the US government had gone into shutdown.
But I mean, the whole episode to me really just served as a reminder of how, even in the age of Trump, and when seemingly the Republicans are often in total disarray, they've got revolts on their own side, they've got a president which is an international laughingstock. Even in a climate like this, the Democrats still just can't get their shit together. To provide a little context for anyone who's unaware, the entire situation the whole issue basically emerged out of the debate surrounding the Dreamers, which are a group of people who are essentially the children of undocumented immigrants, which were given the right to stay in the US under this program, which was implemented by Barack Obama. And Trump unexpectedly ended this program last year, and I mean, officially because he said it wasn't constitutional or something. I mean, obviously unofficially because it was just another bargaining chip to use against the Democrats when they were actually trying to pass a yearly budget, which they still haven't done yet. So it turned out that the Democrats would not, or at least they claimed they would not vote for any budget that didn't include protections for these Dreamers. And by the time that the deadline loomed, they didn't manage to get any concessions from the Republican side, so they shut down the government. Now, the problem was that, as everyone is aware, they couldn't get it going for more than a single working day because several members of the Democratic caucus in the Senate wouldn't support it. You know, you've got the midterms coming up in November, and several Democratic senators are defending states which Donald Trump won by a large margin, so they don't want to be seen in the public eye as supporting a government shutdown, which historically have been very unpopular to the party which was responsible for it happening. Obviously, the last time this happened was in 2013, I believe, where essentially, mainly due to the efforts of Ted Cruz, it was shut down by the Republican Senate, and the Republicans received a pretty big drop in their approval ratings immediately after it happened. Actually, in the long term, there isn't that much evidence to suggest that these shutdowns do have that much impact, but obviously, if you're a Democratic senator up for election in a few months, you don't really want to take any chances. Again, if you are one of those that are trying to defend their position in a state which Donald Trump won by, in some cases, for instance, in West Virginia, by as much as 20 points.
So that makes a lot more sense then, the fact that it's just a complete grinding halt, as he said. And it is a bit of a bargaining chip and a pressure point for the Democrats who Did they agree on a budget finally?
Well, it's they've agreed to extend funding for another 3 weeks until the 8th of February, where they're going to try to have this whole process again and to try to actually pass an annual budget that will keep the government functioning for another year, as opposed to another month, which is what they've been doing for the latter half of 2017, is passing these short monthly budgets, which obviously is kind of chaotic for anyone involved in the machinery of government. I mean, as you mentioned, on the surface, it does provide, at least you would think it would provide some kind of leverage to the Democrats, giving them the opportunity to shut down the government. Unfortunately, I mean, that theory runs into two problems. The first is that, as we've witnessed, the Democrats don't actually have a majority in their own caucus, or a strong enough majority, I should say, in their own caucus to keep this thing going. Something Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, figured out on Monday, and leading the entire party to cave in on the debate. The other issue, of course, is that voters in America, at least, don't really view government shutdowns as a legitimate way to achieve policy goals. They think, as one should, that a party of government should first win an election before trying to pass policy, as opposed to threatening to shut down the entire country to, for instance, provide protections for these dreamers. The issue for the Democrats is that it was pretty clear that the vast majority of Democratic voters supported protecting these dreamers. However, far fewer people supported shutting down the government over the issue. So,
as you're saying, many people support the Dreamers Act. And if we look at this Washington Post article from the 25th of September 2017, there was a survey done by the Washington Post among a sample of a completely random 1,002 adults over the phone, and 86% of these adults that they phoned said that they want to allow DACA arrivals to stay in the US.
Yeah, of course, and as I've mentioned, it is a popular program, especially among Democratic voters who happen to be more pro-immigration and pro-amnesty for undocumented immigrants. The issue comes in two forms. One, again, far fewer of those people would support shutting down the government over something like this. And secondly, the issue in this case isn't exactly all the Democrats in California. It's more the fledgling, fragile Democratic coalitions in states like West Virginia, which the Democrats are desperately trying to hold on to in the midterms.
What about February 8th, if I'm not mistaken, is the day where the next budget has to be passed? Do you think they'll come to an agreement, or do you think there will be just another shutdown?
Well, the concession that the Democratic leadership claims it got from the Republicans over the Dreamers is that the Republicans at least publicly stated that they want a debate in the Senate on the issue of immigration and on the issue of Dreamers. Now, whether it passes the Senate, of course, is another issue, but that's actually not the biggest hurdle in this case. There is a fairly strong bipartisan effort going on right now, which includes about 20 senators, to essentially reach a compromise which would include protections for the Dreamers, as well as funding for Trump's wall and more funding towards immigration enforcement. The issue in this case might actually not be the House, not the Senate, or not Trump, who might refuse to sign the bill in the end. He probably will. The issue is the House, which has a larger Republican majority than the Senate, and Paul Ryan, who's the House Speaker, the Republican House Speaker, has a reputation for refusing to support legislation which doesn't have a majority support among Republican congressmen. So even if it has enough bipartisan support across the aisle to pass this bill, it might still not happen if there is not enough Republican backers on that side. So, we'll see what happens on February the 8th. The thing that really annoyed me about this whole situation is, again, it really showed the ineptitude and the utter lack of strategy on the Democratic side. essentially, again, I'd like to reiterate that the kind of the deal or the concessions they got on Monday were exactly the same as what was offered by the Republicans on Friday. So this whole shutdown just didn't need to happen. And you have to ask, if you are Chuck Schumer, the Democrat leader in the Senate, if you know that several members of your own caucus, or at least enough to stop the shutdown happening, aren't going to support it for a prolonged period of time, then why even bother? And what has happened now is that the Democrats have essentially showed their entire hand. The Republican leadership knows that they don't have the numbers to support another shutdown come February the 8th. So, I mean, on this issue, the Republicans have essentially won. If the Republicans don't want to pass this Dreamer Act, or if they want even more concessions in return for Democratic support in the Senate for it, they basically have it at this point. Chuck Schumer's trying to salvage his reputation by saying, "Oh, now we're not going to support any bill which doesn't include the wall." But sorry, buddy, the game is up. The Republicans know that you don't have the numbers to support another shutdown.
Interesting. So we'll just have to see how it plays out at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens in February, but I mean, I am not hopeful when it comes to this. And again, it's just yet another example of Democrat ineptitude when it comes to, I guess, strategy, because there was no strategy in this. There wasn't even any serious message discipline to speak of. They started the shutdown saying this was all about Dreamers, and then when Chuck Schumer realized that actually not that many Democratic voters, or prospective Democratic voters, supported shutting down the government over the Dreamers issue, they immediately tried to backtrack, or at least on a local level in some of these states that voted for Trump, they tried to backtrack and say, oh, this is about funding for other programs, and nobody fucking bought it, of course.
Yeah, it's just such an internal war inside the government at the end of the day. It just seems they can't come to any agreement on anything, even within their own parties. Moving on from the government as a whole, let's move on to Trump and what's been going on with him this week. He's been at the World Economic Forum and given some controversial speeches there. But what we're more interested in is Trump coming to the UK.
Yes, of course. So this has been a quite long-running saga dating back to when he was first elected, and Theresa May being as far as I'm aware, the first world leader to fly to Washington to, appear before his new throne, desperate for trade concessions during the Brexit process. And she immediately, as a gesture of goodwill, offered him a full state visit then. And then, of course, it became a long-running saga where clearly officials in the Trump administration realized that Trump wasn't quite as popular in the UK, or at least in London, as they might have initially assumed, although I don't know. So it's been up in the air whether he would kind of take the political risk to come here amid all the inevitable protests that will happen. But it looks like it is happening later this year.
It probably will. It makes sense. It'd be silly to shut out the quote-unquote lead of the free world. But a lot of the opposition is understandable. If we go back to late last year when Trump retweeted some videos from, well, he had no idea who they were. He just retweeted them. But they were by Britain First, far-right group that is inherently racist.
So there was an interview about it this week on the BBC where he stated that he was prepared to apologize, right?
He did say that, yes, but I don't understand why he wouldn't just apologize straight away. You can't say, well, I am ready to be sorry.
Well, I think, as with many things with Trump, this isn't exactly some deep political 4D chess he's playing. I think the guy just has an insane ego that necessitates well, never backing away from anything. And from a lot of his experience so far in office, that might not actually be the worst strategy for him.
No, the full-on alpha male rampage that he seems to be on throughout, not just seems to be on, but seems to have been on for years, is quite frankly a legitimate tactic. It is working for him in certain aspects. So the never backing down, and yes, it can seem to be quite clumsy and dangerous, but at the end of the day, we'll have to look back on it once his term is over.
So let me ask you this. Do you personally think that Trump should be given a state visit to the UK?
Yeah, he definitely should.
Really?
I believe he should, yes. I know it'd be met with protests, but as I was talking to a friend of mine this week, he was saying that there was rumors going around that May would shut down the protests for Trump to come over. However, that would mean that the protesters won.
I mean, does May even have that kind of capability?
I wouldn't think so. No.
I mean, look, let's put it this way. I mean, Theresa May, her popularity in the UK, I think it's safe to say, is already fragile.
Very low.
To say the least. I don't think the image of the Metropolitan Police trying to break up protesting an even more unpopular figure in the UK than herself, I don't think that would do very well for her domestic image.
No, not at all. But back to the original point at hand, it seems to be kind of a catch-22, because if Trump doesn't come over, it's just kind of absurd having this divide, and having May going over to the US to talk to Trump, negotiate with Trump and whatnot, is giving in to his home ground.
So you think that once, I guess what you're trying to say is that once we have offered him the trip, it really would be silly to take it back and say, oh, you can't come here after all, right? Well, I mean, my question was more kind of fundamental. Is ignoring that, should we even have someone like Donald Trump coming here on an official visit? Again, someone who has unquestionably expressed support for extremists in the UK, someone who is deeply unpopular with the UK public, someone who has in the past shown no remorse in essentially exploiting terrorist atrocities in the UK to further his political agenda. I mean, is this someone that we should even invite here in the first place? I mean, it's the argument, aside from the whole whether we need to maintain the relationship with the United States and how far we are prepared to do that. I guess the question fundamentally is more of a moral one, I guess.
It is, that's quite true. But the way I see it is, if we're talking about Donald Trump, the person, coming to the UK on a business visit if he were not president, but having said all the things that he has said, of course I wouldn't support it. But we're talking about the 45th president of the United States here. Despite being as dreadful as he is, we just have to allow him to come over on a state visit to negotiate. It's just simply the political game.
So you're basically taking a kind of a realist position here, saying that yeah, he's a bastard, but let's have him anyway because, well, it might earn us some much needed favor in the Trump administration.
Yeah, that would also work. Despite me not supporting him, being on his side, at the end of the day, may be the most positive thing for the UK as it stands right now. Because the EU is still on that ice. Of course, the UK is still in the European Union, but the EU is saying that it's not too late to step back, not too late to turn around and to call off the whole Brexit deal. But if Brexit is going to go ahead, having the support of the United States is not only necessary, but logical. So what would you think? Would you allow Trump in? What's your point of view on the matter?
Well, I think my opinion is that we should never have offered him the state visit anyway, or at least that early, because again, there is no precedent for an American president being offered a state visit to the UK that early in his reign, right? This was mere months after Trump's election victory, and even less after his inauguration. Essentially, if we are taking a kind of this realist international relations position on this, would you not agree that, immediately flying over the Atlantic to Washington and trying to win his favor that early on, does that not just come off, as we are exiting the European Union, does that not just come off as an incredible sign of weakness? That we are so desperate to have him there?
Absolutely. That was my first reaction when I read an article saying that May had gone over to visit Trump that early on. I was just surprised, but also disappointed. Because, yes, despite the realist view where we're talking about leaders meeting leaders, if we think about the tactical standpoint, the strategic standpoint, where time is a bargaining chip and it's a resource, waiting is a very, very useful move. So, yes, it is an incredible sign of weakness on the UK's part on the international relations stage.
I mean, I think it's kind of interesting to contrast the way that Theresa May has dealt with Donald Trump. And obviously her relationship with him, especially after the whole fiasco over the Britain First retweets, isn't, the greatest right now. It's certainly not foul, but it's hardly where you would want how close you would expect a British Prime Minister to be with an American president, especially if you look at at least the relatively very close relationship between Cameron and Obama and Blair and Bush. I think when talking about this, I think it's very interesting to look at how other world leaders have very successfully managed to build up a positive relationship with Trump. And I will just give two examples here. The first being Emmanuel Macron in France and Xi Jinping in China. Now, Macron, of course, is, by most accounts, to the left on social and economic issues than Theresa May. So even further away from Trump, in that artificial political spectrum kind of view. Yet he is someone who has a very good relationship with Trump, and I think that's partly because the French kind of understood very well how to win Trump over, and as I'll come on to in a second, it's not something that I think we can offer him. What Macron basically did, and Macron and Trump, they're both terrible narcissists. That doesn't necessarily make one of them a bad person, but it is a personality trait that they definitely share, and I think maybe that allowed Macron to understand the U.S. president a bit better. But when Trump was invited to Paris for Bastille Day, he was given a front seat at the spectacular military parade. He was showered with kind of positive energy, making him feel like he was on top of the world. He was given he had a dinner with Macron at the top of the Eiffel Tower. The lot, right? And similarly in China. He was the first U.S. president to visit, I think, the Forbidden Palace or the Forbidden City, and he was, he even tweeted about it, right? Oh, I'm the first guy to be given this spectacular privilege. It seems that a lot of world leaders, like in France, like in China, are figuring out how to leverage Trump's narcissism to win favor with him, but this is not something that I think we in the UK can offer him, partly because, again, if he comes here, sure, we can put on a great military parade for him, as silly as that would be, but it would still be massively overshadowed by the enormous protest that will happen all over London.
So what China and France have done, which is quite intelligent, they fed his ego by congratulating him and rewarding him as an adult, yet when the time has come, they have scolded him like a child for his missteps. Many, many of them. So they were at the forefront of this international relation between them. However, as you say, how can the UK catch up to that? Well, not only do you have the shadow of the protests hanging over the whole event, however, the shadow of France and China's welcome.
Yeah, well, and I mean, what I find especially extraordinary about this is that Theresa May, at least on the surface, makes a much better political ally to Donald Trump than either Macron or the Chinese. I mean, again, she is from the conservative wing of British politics, from the right, just like Trump. She has stood out for many years in the Conservative Party as an immigration hardliner, right? Like, even on that issue, she is alarmingly close to Trump, I guess. On the other hand, you have the Chinese, who, of course, Trump has savaged terribly throughout the campaign. You would think it would make for a terrible relationship after he actually became president. And then you have Emmanuel Macron, who is,
progressive.
Well,
extremely progressive.
Well, whatever you think about his economic policy, on social issues, he is the polar opposite of Trump. His entire PR thing is trying to build himself as the liberal anti-Trump. He even made a big point out of mocking Trump's whole "Make America Great Again" thing over his refusal to join the Paris Climate Agreement. Macron had this whole "Make Our Planet Great Again" thing going on, which was kind of funny. So it's almost like, while the British have been relegated to kind of conventional diplomacy, the other kind of big international players have realized that when you deal with Trump, you have to deal with him maybe on a more personal level, appealing to his more narcissistic instincts, and that ultimately Trump is a person who, despite all the racism, despite all the absurd bluster, he is someone who just wants to be popular. He is someone who has spent his entire life trying to make himself a story, right? He is someone who wants to be admired. He spent his entire career trying to make outlets like the New York Times give a shit about him before becoming president, right? And with Theresa May, I guess, we just don't have the kind of things to offer him, partly because he's just so unpopular in the UK, and partly because Theresa May just isn't a very charismatic negotiator, is she?
No, not at all. But you were saying how France and China don't have that much in common with the US, and yet they've befriended Trump. I think it goes back to the basic old school strategy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And how does that apply?
Well, it applies if we're thinking of the possible or real, I'd say it's real, Cold War that is going on right now with North Korea. If France and China want to stand in line with any big nation, one of the power players, befriending the US, not being straight allies and saying that we'll stand by you to the end of the earth, quite literally, but at least being on their good side is just a classic tactic.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there is one more thing I'd like to bring up on this issue, and I think I want to do it carefully because I don't want to be accused of being like an SJW playing identity politics when I don't have to, but I think this is a very interesting point. If you look at world leaders with whom Trump has managed to build up a very good rapport, so you have Macron, a very kind of alpha male figure, again, a narcissist just like Trump. You have Xi Jinping, the strong man in China, and you have Vladimir Putin, the macho autocratic leader of Russia. Not to mention Erdogan, of course, who Trump also explicably has a very good relationship with, and Benjamin Netanyahu, all these kind of autocratic macho male strongmen. And when you look at the kind of leaders with whom Trump has feuded over and over again, now you have May, of course, where the relationship isn't totally hostile, but it's not great either. And then the quintessential example is Angela Merkel, who Trump has spent such a great amount of energy on trying to delegitimize and trying to
almost
ridicule. Yeah, I mean, I do think that I don't think it's a crazy, especially since Trump himself is a master of playing the identity politics. I don't think it's crazy to assume that there really is a bit of an element of classic sexism here.
Oh, totally. Trump is not just the man of the house, the man of the White House. He, as you said, he is attracted to like-minded, or at least not like-minded, but with similar traits, quote-unquote alpha males. If we're speaking on a almost exaggerated way. But yeah, you're quite right. It's interesting to see how he relates to other male politicians that shared traits with him.
So finally on this topic, if and when Trump finally does come to the UK, presumably it will be to London, will you be out there in the crowds with your placard?
Will I be protesting against his visit?
In person?
I don't think so.
Shame.
Stepping aside from politics and moving on to entertainment with historical politics, this week I went to see Darkest Hour, a new film that came out at the end of last year in the United States. However, it came out on the 12th of January here in the UK. And it is the story of Winston Churchill in his darkest moments, which was when he was appointed.
The first few weeks of him being prime minister at not at the start of the Second World War, but at as the film's title alludes to, in the darkest hour, at least for Britain, during the Second World War, which is when France was being overrun by the Germans, and when it seemed for a minute that the entire British army might be trapped on the continent with no way out, and the film, of course, deals with his struggle to maintain the war, facing essentially internal opposition who want to sue for peace with Hitler, and his kind of reckoning with that.
As you say, yes. Before I move on to more specifics about the film, something I felt about this film which landed at exactly the right time. Dunkirk was an absolutely phenomenal war film, and it showed you what the war was like on the ground and in the air and the sea. That's also where the film takes place, but it shows what the soldiers felt at the time, and I feel this is the perfect political and local counterpart to Dunkirk.
Yeah, I mean, precisely. I think as exactly as you said, Dunkirk was kind of the boots on the ground of that same time period. Well, of course, Dunkirk taking place over a shorter few days, but during that same moment. While with Darkest Hour, you have the political element of that particular struggle.
Indeed. So Winston Churchill is played by Gary Oldman, but quite frankly, for 95% of the film, it's not Gary Oldman, it's Churchill. I was blown away by the prosthetics and makeup, and of course, Gary Oldman being the absolutely fantastic actor that he is, just completely embodied the Prime Minister. So Churchill himself as a person was quite a character. I had no idea he was this eccentric. He was just bonkers. He'd have scotch in the morning when he woke up with his breakfast, which
as you do,
is saying he'd go to bed at about 4 a.m. and he had this kind of power hour moment where in the middle of the night he'd do his most intense reflection, which is a characteristic trait of other great leaders, as apparently Margaret Thatcher used to do the same thing.
But I think, with Darkest Hour, I think there are three main pillars, which, at least in my opinion, make this film so great. The first is, of course, Gary Oldman's performance as Churchill was absolutely mesmerizing. All hats off to the guy, especially since I actually read that during the filming, he ended up getting nicotine poisoning from all the Cuban cigars he had to smoke.
He did indeed.
During its production. So, Gary Oldman's performance, without a doubt, perhaps the main selling point of the film. Secondly, I thought actually the way it was filmed was also very good.
It was very clever. For anybody listening who hasn't seen the film, there's some moments where, this isn't a spoiler at all, he would step into a lift and go down a lift, for example, and they just filmed the lift against complete darkness, and it would move across the screen, and then there were other transitions which were also quite slidey, clunky.
I mean, I think my favorite one out of those kind of visual tricks is when he is on his toilet, on the phone to Roosevelt, essentially at that point begging for help from the American president. I'm sure there's a lot of jokes we can make about that with our current political situation, but the scene ends with Roosevelt essentially saying that, no, sorry, there's my hands are tied by Congress. There's nothing I can do right now to help you, Winston. And again, they do the same kind of visual trick as with the elevator, where it zooms out through like this kind of dollhouse view of him in his toilet, and it just kind of zooms out, and you have him just in his like little box, completely isolated by darkness, which of course visually illustrates his growing isolation from any kind of outside help that might come to save them in that very desperate moment. And I think that kind of leads to the third thing I really, really liked about that film. And there's a lot of comparisons to Downfall I want to make, especially with regards to the excellent acting. But as much as that film, I think Darkest Hour just perfectly captures this atmosphere of utter desperation and utter kind of isolation from any solutions to this incredibly desperate situation which these people find themselves in. Again, at this point, with the entire British army being trapped in France, with at the time seemingly no way out, with Hitler storming across the continent, and I think, as I said, that feeling of isolation and desperation is something the film captured very, very well.
Oh, indeed, there was that feeling of, I wouldn't say hysteria, but just pure melancholy in the face of Nazi Germany. It's just, you look back on it and there was no way Britain should have or could have won the war. It was just absurd.
Yeah, I mean, with retrospect now, of course, we have a lot of people saying, Germany lost the war the moment it started it, just because, for whatever reason they give, it had too few resources, it was totally outnumbered in manpower.
Of course, but
in that moment, it really is easy to see how, especially with the Soviet Union and with America not yet in the fight, just how desperate the situation for the British was.
Yeah, it did capture that quite perfectly. However, there was one scene that really irked me. I just thought it was very clearly a Hollywood / Academy Award board scene where
the proper industry term is Oscar bait.
Yeah, it was definitely an Oscar bait. And I think you know what scene it is before I even mention it. So Churchill apparently had never taken the tube in his life.
Yes.
And one day he does decide to take the tube, and he speaks to the people on the tube who inspire him, and he believes, well, I am fighting for something, I'm fighting for the British people. But I don't have a problem with that appearing in the film. I do have a problem with the execution, and it was very clear Oscar bait.
Yeah.
They just seemed to put a couple elements that made it very clear that it stepped away from the historical accuracy. Not which, and I mean to say this as tactfully as possible, but one of the characters that appears on the scene is a young black man who completes one of Churchill's poetry quotes, and is also focused on because he is in a mixed race relationship, which in the context of the film, of course, seems like very clear Oscar bait.
Especially since, in real life, Churchill was not known for his, should I say, progressive social views. I mean, the guy was, whatever your view of him as a great parliamentarian, as a great speaker, as a great war leader, he was a very clear racist. So I think that particularly, was one of the several issues of historical revisionism which kind of irked me in that film.
Indeed, yeah, and continuing on with the tube scene, there's a moment where he speaks to a little girl, and she says, "No, I'll never surrender. I'll always support Britain and fight," or whatever. And you're thinking, of course, they also have to throw in the weirdly politically minded child that inspires him to give the great speech at the end. So that scene I'm kind of annoyed at because it was very clear Oscar bait, but the film as a whole is just so bloody fantastic that scene is permissible.
Yeah, of course. And I guess I would like to say a bit about that particularly because, as I've mentioned before, I think the film is fantastic. I think the acting is fantastic. The atmosphere they build is great. The cinematography is brilliant. But the biggest issue I do have of it is kind of the blend of over-dramatization and together with quite a substantial bit of historical revisionism. Aside from kind of the little nitpicky things of Churchill getting on the tube and with these specific individuals he finds himself talking to. The premise of the film coming back to that theme of isolation is the film went a step further from the historical reality of Britain finding itself isolated and took it to this place of Churchill being personally isolated within his own administration and finding himself the only figure who still wants to essentially keep fighting the war with Germany. The film basically gives this impression that everyone around Churchill essentially at that point wanted to surrender and wanted to cut a deal with the Nazis, which, it's just not true. There was for instance, in the film you have these, you see these meetings of Churchill's war cabinet, where in the film it is portrayed that Churchill, wants to keep fighting, and you have this figure of Lord Edward Halifax, played by Stannis Baratheon, clearly not finding any more daughters to sacrifice to win the war, wanting to cut a deal with the Nazis through Mussolini as a mediator.
As a mediator.
Yeah. And Churchill essentially being alone in these meetings as the one person who wants to keep fighting the war. In reality, that wasn't even remotely the case. Of course, you had Halifax, who was an advocate for a diplomatic solution to the conflict. But then you also had people like, primarily Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, and Anthony Eden, the future Foreign Secretary and Conservative Prime Minister, who were both staunchly against any sort of peaceful solution. And the film basically portrays both individuals as, I guess, not so much vocally in support of peace, but basically saying nothing. Attlee has a scene at the beginning of the movie where he basically lambasts Chamberlain in the Commons, but afterwards his character basically doesn't say a single thing. And with regards to Eden, there is a scene where Halifax is having a massive go at Churchill for why they need to end the war now, and Churchill looks to Eden for support, and says Anthony, and Eden says nothing, which, again, I think is a quite a deviation from the actual historical reality.
True, but keep in mind we're talking about a very fine line between... Well, not a fine line, but there's a very clear difference between historical accuracy and historically based entertainment. I'm sure it wouldn't be as exciting for the viewer if it was 100% historically accurate.
Well, I think I actually have to disagree with you there, because, and I think this applies to many films that are made about the Second World War. The Second World War is such a colossal conflict with so many tense, emotional and global moments happening that I don't think you really need to make that much stuff up to make it seem terribly dramatic. I think actually it was more of a symptom of what happened after Churchill's death, which is him being put up on this spectacular pedestal, essentially turning him into this kind of godlike figure in British politics. Again, I'm not trying to disparage his role as Britain's war leader, but to his own admission, Churchill did say that history would be kind to him, for he would be the one to write it. And I think this film serves as a pretty brilliant example of that kind of historical revisionism, putting him as this only person in the center of this conflict.
I do see that, but to retort your point, this film did remind me of another story that is also quite political, historical, and emotional, and that is Invictus. Despite the book being one of my favorite books for different reasons, the film itself talks about the story of how Nelson Mandela brought together South Africa with the focus of the film is rugby.
Right.
Of course, the book is quite a historical retelling where it's not fictionalized at all. It tells you about his routines, about what he did. It gives you a bit of an insight into the South African political system. However, the film, as The Darkest Hour did, is there to entertain. So instead of focusing on Mandela, it focuses on Springbok captain Francois Pienaar, who, well, originally wasn't captain, and when he was appointed to be the captain of the Springboks for the coming World Cup, he was quite reluctant, and it's about his friendship with Mandela. It's a wonderful film, and it does tell a lot of historical details quite accurately, but as happens with Darkest Hour, it's not a historical retelling, more of a dramatization. Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of Officially Denied. If you'd like to see more of us, give us a follow on Instagram at Officially Denied. We'll respond to every comment, every message. We'd love to hear from you. Give us some feedback. And we are also now on your preferred podcast platform of choice. Our episodes are available on iTunes, which means that they are available on any podcast app that you may use.
All right, so thanks everyone for tuning in, and we will catch you next week.